I think of the brain like I think about a muscle. They're
Mm.
actually surprisingly similar. The primary driver of initial brain development is stimulating the brain. The brain responds to stimulus just like your muscles respond to stimulus,
Mm.
say if you're doing some kind of exercise. Any skill that you're trying to develop, you need to spend short periods of time working at the edges of your current capacity, and then you need to back off and give yourself time to rest and recover. And that's the same for focus, just as it's the same for learning how to write computer code, just as it's the same for learning how to dance or a new language or a musical instrument.
Dr. Tommy Wood, a renowned neuroscientist whose work in cognitive decline and brain health is recognized globally. I can guarantee you every single person listening to this has an internal critic that's really loud inside of them. Yet we all just kind of go around saying we're fine the whole time and trying to do better.
When it comes to brain health, that story that you have in your head about your brain, about how it doesn't work like it used to, all I can do is make it worse by not sleeping enough and stressing, and it's just completely wrong.
There's so much of a conversation around mindset and brain health that is so overlooked. When it comes to our cognitive mental health state and our mindset and the importance of it, for you, how do you think about this in terms to brain function and brain health?
Your brain is absolutely capable of improving and changing its trajectory of function at any time in your life.
I'm your host, Sarah Ann Macklin, and I'm on a mission to uncover the maze of health myths around nutrition and well-being and guide you through my 7 pillars of health. Join me on a journey of discovery and connection and pull up a pew for a front row seat to the most exclusive health conversations of our time. Welcome to Live Well, Be Well. If you've watched one episode and enjoyed it, I'd love to ask in agreement for you to subscribe to the show. Subscribing is such a small thing, but gives so much exposure, bringing bigger guests, bigger production, and more that we can deliver each week to more people. Every time you subscribe, it shows me that you enjoy the content. So if you do me a favor, and if you've enjoyed the show, please press subscribe. Dr. Tommy Wood, welcome back to Live Well, Be Well. I'm so happy to have you back on the show for the second time. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and very excited to be back. Thanks for having me on again.
I'm so thrilled to have you back. Now, I think I said before, you have one of the most impressive CVs to date. And honestly, when we had our last conversation, you highlighted such a plethora of areas, and some we touched upon very lightly and some we kind of went quite in depth on, but I kind of want to recap some of these concepts that we spoke about. Now, I want to touch upon diet and our brain health. I want to talk about exercise and our brain health, and I want to talk about the importance of even how we talk to ourselves and the effect it has on our physiology. So to start with, this is one that we spoke about very lightly, but since our conversation now, it must have been a year and a half ago, this conversation has come up time and time again. So I thought, I'm going to bring you on to talk about it, and it's creatine, because I know that you talk about this a lot. And I think it's your favorite supplement, actually, creatine monohydrate. And so I thought, what better way to start than kicking it off with this? Now, I think many of our listeners will have heard of creatine, maybe not creatine monohydrate. So I want you to explain a little bit more about that. But do we all need creatine? Because I think a lot of us, especially women listening to this, might associate it more with strength and sports and things like that, and maybe bodybuilding. So when it comes to our brain, how important is creatine and the form that we take it in?
So we all need creatine, and I don't mean it as a supplement. I just mean it as a molecule in our bodies. It is ubiquitous throughout all of our cells, and it's used as an energy buffer in particular. So like a short-term energy buffer. It has some other functions as well, but it's so important that it's one of the molecules that is most dependent on methylation. People will have no doubt heard of methylation, and actually a significant chunk of your methylation currency is spent on producing creatine because it's such a critical molecule. So we make it ourselves, and we make it from amino acids, and people can get a good amount, obviously, from their own production. But there is quite a lot of evidence to support that supplementation can be beneficial as well. If you eat a large amount of meat and fish, particularly salmon, then maybe you don't need to supplement. And I don't, even though it is my favorite supplement and I recommend it very freely, I don't I'm not going to say that everybody has to take it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it has a long history in bodybuilding and athletics.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
it's very safe, and it is ergogenic. It improves power production and strength, and so that means you can push yourself a little bit harder, get a few more reps in the gym. It helps build muscle and strength in that way. Um, but it also has similar functions in the brain. And rather than being a strength athlete, not everybody has to be a strength athlete, although I think we all are in some way if we move our bodies.
Mm.
But you probably want to be a cognitive athlete of some kind. You want your brain to perform well when you want it to perform well. And creatine helps in a few scenarios. So there's evidence that those who consume more creatine from the diet have a lower risk of mental health disorders, particularly depression. And there are 2 or 3 randomized
Wow.
controlled trials where they added creatine to an antidepressant medication in those who didn't respond fully to the antidepressant medication. And they saw improvements in depression scores in those who took creatine. So it seems to help with mood in a range of individuals, from athletes through to elderly individuals, and it has a greater effect in those who are older. But if you take creatine, it seems to support general cognitive function. So that's been shown in several studies, and the like I said, the benefit is greater in those who are older, but younger people and athletes do seem to benefit as well. And then the final the final group, and this is probably relevant to lots of people, is that creatine taken as a single dose, and a relatively high dose, but taken as a single dose after sleep deprivation, seems to improve or at least allow you to maintain cognitive function, and that's been shown again in athletes and in the general population. So there are a range of ways that creatine seems to benefit both mood and cognitive function more broadly. Um, the form of
Can I ask one
creatine,
question
yes,
there?
absolutely.
Because you mentioned that, so I'm just thinking, I have had, I'm aware of the importance of creatine, for our brains, but not to the extent that having a bad night's sleep, having a high dose of creatine can help improve cognitive function.
Mm.
So that will definitely perk up a lot of people just listening to this. I mean, lots of us can be sleep deprived. We might be new mums. I mean, there's kind of a whole plethora. We might be working ourselves, into a very heavy cognitive load that we're not sleeping very well. So would that be just on a supplement, or could you have, a high amount of kind of creatine foods the next day, such as you said, like fish and meat? And would that have the same effect? Or is it just simply taking a high dose supplement? What would you advise there for the next day if that's kind of what the research is showing? Recent studies in the UK have shown a concerning trend. Nearly a third of Britons suffer with insomnia or severe sleep disturbances, with stress, screens, and sleep hygiene largely to blame. This isn't just about feeling groggy in the morning. The NHS has linked poor sleep with a high risk in chronic conditions such as heart disease, diabetes, obesity, and not to mention the impact on poor mental health. That's why I'm excited to share with you my experience with Natramat, a company that truly understands the science of sleep. Crafted in Devon with its organic, renewable materials, Natramat mattresses are a testament to what it means to sleep naturally. Unlike the common mattresses that trap heat and moisture, Natramat's use of organic wool and coconut fibre ensures your body remains at a comfortable temperature throughout the night, promoting a more deeper, restorative night's sleep. But what really sets Natramat apart is their commitment to sustainability. As the UK's first B Corp certified bed and mattress company, they're not just talking about environmental responsibility, they're living it. From their solar-powered workshops to their groundbreaking Mattress for Life initiative, choosing Natramat is a choice for a healthier planet. I personally visited Natramat's showroom in Chiswick and I was amazed at their sleep zone. It's designed to give you a real sense of how their mattresses can transform your sleep. The calming ambience, the bespoke sleep aroma, and the privacy to truly relax and feel the difference. It's an experience that I would recommend to anyone who is serious about improving their sleep quality. For my UK listeners looking to transform their sleep and by extension their health, I encourage you to visit natramat.co.uk. And don't forget, being a Live Well Be Well listener, you can get 10% off your first order using the code LIVEWELL. Invest in your sleep, your health, and your planet with Naturomat.
Yeah, there's probably a little bit of both. So
Mm.
when they've done the sleep deprivation studies, there was a well-known study that's a few years old now where they did this in rugby players, and they had them be sleep deprived or not, and they showed that creatine was as good as caffeine at maintaining complex motor skills after sleep
Wow.
deprivation. And some people might like that because maybe caffeine makes them jittery, and there are some nice data on how caffeine and other stimulants can make us feel better, and they can make us think that we're performing better, but we're performing worse. So and maybe we'll talk about that as well. But creatine is maybe
Yes.
a nice option there. And then there's a much more recent study that came out just a few months ago that showed something similar, and it's improving energetics in the brain as we might expect after a night of sleep deprivation. And they took 0.35 grams per kilo. So for a 70 kilo individual, this would be about 20 grams, which is like a loading dose of creatine for anybody who's familiar with the dosing. But it's just like 4 scoops of a creatine powder. That's not astronomical amounts of creatine, and creatine in those doses have been studied long term in people, very safe. It's been studied in the elderly, it's been studied in postmenopausal women. Um, so these doses are not abnormal. But if you are taking a regular creatine supplement, you might take 5 to 10 grams a day. So it's just a little bit, maybe 2 to 4 times a regular sort of long term creatine supplement dose. You can get those kinds of doses from food, but I mean we're probably talking like several kilos of beef and fish a day to achieve it. So not impossible, but probably quite difficult. There are some
Yeah.
animal studies that suggest that if you take creatine long term, actually you seem to maintain cognitive function odd, but whilst requiring slightly less sleep. So this might then say if you're taking long term sort of supplemental doses of creatine during periods of maybe less than ideal sleep, creatine can perhaps help you maintain cognitive function longer term as well. But that's mainly based on animal studies, so less good. Whereas the acute stuff after like a single night of sleep deprivation in humans seems to be pretty reproducible.
And do we know why? Do you know why it can work in the same way as caffeine can work with brain functioning? Is there an understanding with the mechanism of how that's happening?
Um, yeah, yes and no. One of the ways that it seems to be having it is providing this short term energy buffer, and
Hmm.
when you're sleep deprived, maybe there's a slight you end up with different areas of the brain, yeah, essentially not functioning at their optimal level because there's still a number of things sort of suppressing metabolic function like adenosine, and then maybe creatine by improving the sort of energy status can help overcome some of that. Some people find that creatine is slightly stimulating, like directly itself. So it's potentially having some other effects. We know it affects mitochondrial calcium handling, which is really important for energy production and overall sort of cellular health. So it has these other functions, and I'll say that we think we know some of what creatine does, but people have argued equally that in contexts like mental health, the the energy sort of the energy substrate idea of creatine isn't enough to really explain what it seems to be doing. So it's possible that it's doing some stuff that we just don't understand yet.
I mentioned there when we started, and I know I love that you also said, which I'm very passionate about, it's not just about supplementation or everybody needs supplementation, but actually,
Mm,
from the food sources, it's looking at meat and fish and animal products as having these rich doses. But if we are thinking about supplementation, and I say this because many people have become plant-based eaters or just don't like fish,
mm.
what should they be looking for? Because I did say creatine monohydrate, and I think many people might not be aware of that term and that type of creatine supplement because there's loads on the market. So, having one that we both have spoken about, I think is really important. Can you explain why that one is so important to choose when it comes to this?
Absolutely. It's nice because creatine monohydrate is the the one that's the best researched. In fact, it's the only creatine that's really been extensively researched. And all of the studies that I would ever mention about creatine use creatine monohydrate. It's also the cheapest and the easiest to get, which is nice.
Great.
And it's very inexpensive. The majority of it is actually produced under the name Creapure. It's made in Germany. And then if you buy like a sports supplement that has creatine monohydrate as either, like a powder with like a little scoop, or as pills, it's just white labeled, but all produced by the same company. I would recommend that people look for a product that contains Creapure because we know that it's high quality. There are other places making creatine monohydrate, but then you don't really know necessarily what's in there. So Creapure, creatine monohydrate, but again, that's what most reputable sports supplement companies, and that's you usually buy it from a sports supplement company. That's what they tend to use. So you can see it on the back of the packet. And you get this in Holland Barrett. They probably have it in Boots. You can order it off Amazon, right? And it's pretty cheap, easy to get. Um, all other forms of creatine, and there are lots where they try and pH balance it, or I've even seen some
Mm.
liposomal forms and some of the other fancy things. Don't bother with any of that. Just get the basic
Ignore.
stuff. Ignore.
Mhm.
Not worth your time. Not worth your money. They're not studied. They haven't been shown to be better, or at least as good as the good old creatine monohydrate, which has been used for decades at this point.
I feel like from that, if you are plant based, you should probably be veering towards looking at supplementation if you're not plant based, and having a look at how much fish and meat you're getting in your diet throughout the week to see if you're hitting these types of markers. Is that right? If you're just you're plant based, you might be struggling to get this amount in your diet.
Yeah, certainly. Individuals who are plant based
Mm.
have lower creatine intakes from the diet. There are now, I mean, most of it is nutrition epidemiology, but we can see some of it from the interventional literature, randomized control trials, at least with creatine, that those who are plant based do seem to have a higher risk of certain mental health disorders, including depression. And creatine intake could be one of the things contributing to that. There's also reverse causation, which maybe people struggle with their mental health, so therefore they go plant based to try and improve their health. Right? It's difficult to untangle all of this stuff, and I'm not saying that going plant based is going to negatively affect your mental health at all, but from some of these different pieces, it could be that the creatine intake is playing a role there. Absolutely.
Hmm. Well, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because we know that we need to be eating more plant-based foods for our gut microbiome, but then it's balancing out that if we are consuming more and we're naturally reducing our animal products, like where would we be missing out, such as our B12s and something else I want to talk to you about, which is omega-3, which I speak a lot about if somebody is plant-based, and brain health, because it's something that I am completely obsessed with. Everyone who listens to this podcast and I talk about omega-3 all the time. And trundling through your website today, looking at all your fantastic publications. By the way, incredible, there is a lot. I saw one actually in relation to DHA and brain health. So,
Mm.
let's talk about this. Let's talk about omega-3 and brain health and how we should be looking at this sector. How important is it for our cognitive functioning, and how much should we be consuming of it a week, either in a fatty fish form or if not in a supplementation form?
Um, DHA, the long chain omega-3 fatty acid, or the longest chain that we really think about being important for our health, um, it's critical. It's essential for the brain. And the brain, depending on the region of the fatty acids in the brain, DHA may make up something like 15 to 25% of the fats in the brain, and sort of again change differs by region, differs by age, this kind of stuff. But your brain is mainly fat, and a really big chunk of that fat is DHA. And when the brain is growing in the first place, in utero, as we say, or during pregnancy, um, DHA transfer from the mother to the fetus is a very tightly regulated process, such that the mother's DHA status will be sacrificed in order to make sure that the fetus gets enough DHA. And then if the mother has a very high DHA status, it will be reined back, right? It's really tightly
Mm.
regulated. And then this DHA accumulation in the brain continues after birth over the first few years. Its primary role seems to be at the synapse, which is where neurons talk to each other. It kind of sits there in the membrane.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that there are, again, large epidemiological type studies where you look at people's omega-3 status, their DHA status, and you look at their long-term health outcomes. And for omega-3 broadly, it's associated with lower mortality risk, lower dementia risk, lower cardiovascular disease risk. DHA in particular, but actually EPA as well, which is the slightly shorter chain omega-3s. But those two, EPA and DHA, people will be familiar from your podcast, being the ones that you tend to get from seafood. Both really critical
Yeah.
for the brain. EPA may be more to do with vascular function, but how your
Mm.
blood vessels function is really important for your brain as well. So both are important together. When you look at supplementation with omega-3s and things like preventing dementia or Alzheimer's disease, the results are really rather mixed. There have been lots of randomized controlled trials that they give people omega-3s and then they don't see much of a benefit, and then they say, well, omega-3s don't work, they don't really matter that much.
Mm.
But there's a really critical nuance that comes out, which is that DHA. So if we think about DHA in the brain, it's not like this standalone thing that you eat it and all of a sudden it ends up in your brain doing the stuff that it needs to do, right? That's not how biology works. So the way that I think about it is, what does it take for a DHA molecule to end up in the membrane of a synapse in your brain doing its job? And so obviously you need to consume it, and one of the most important things that we have to regulate that process is our fat stores. Our fat stores actually end up being DHA stores for our brain. It's one of the reasons why humans are born with fat babies, is because you have this nice little store of fats, either to make ketones for the developing brain or to supply DHA to the developing brain. So we have these little DHA stores, and then they have to get into we sort of eat them. They go into they tend to cycle through the adipose tissue, and then they're trafficked up into the brain. From there, you need to attach the DHA to a phospholipid. So anybody who doesn't care to remember biochemistry, if they ever learned it, a phospholipid is this hydrophilic or water-loving head group, and then you have fats on the other side, and they kind of make this bilayer that
Mm-hmm.
it makes at the membrane of the cells. And now, as I explain biochemistry to everybody, you're desperately wondering how you can get me off this track, but it's too late. So I'm going to finish this thought. So you're going to attach fats to your phospholipid, right? So you need you need that head group, and that head group is made
Mm-hmm.
up of choline, ethanolamine, or serine, as phosphatidyl, ethanolamine, choline, and serine. Most of the DHA in the brain is as phosphatidyl, ethanolamine, and phosphatidylserine. Choline is important as well, but less so. But all of these things are interchangeable. You can convert between choline and ethanolamine, but you need methylation in order to do that. So where I'm getting to finally is that if you want DHA to be sitting in your brain, first of all, you need some precursor to that head group. So you need to be consuming enough
Mm-hmm.
choline and maybe some serine and ethanolamine, and you can get all of those either from eggs or from lecithin if you're plant-based, both soy and sunflower. And then you need methylation to kind of regulate the head group that you've got. So you need a good B vitamin status. Finally, getting to my point, there are 3 randomized controlled trials now that show that if you have good omega-3 status or good B vitamin status, you don't get benefit in terms of cognitive function. But if you improve both, then you do see benefit, right? So you need a combination of good omega-3 status and good methylation status in order to get your DHA where you want it to go in your brain. There are now 3 studies that have shown this, either supplementing with B vitamins to lower homocysteine or with omega-3s to improve omega-3 status. It doesn't work if you don't have enough of the other one. So this is where, when you just do a trial and you just give people omega-3s, if you don't take other aspects of their health and nutrition into account, you might say, hey, this doesn't work. But actually, it's a multi-step process. So this gets back to part of your original question, which is we then need to ensure that we have good omega-3 status, but we also need to ensure good B vitamin status. And one of the best ways, sort of broadly, to measure that is by measuring homocysteine.
I mean, that literally just mic drops the importance on not isolating one nutrient. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really important that they all work together in synergy. And
Yeah.
so many times when we kind of look at supplements on their own or isolated, or we're supplementing something back in, but we're not looking at our overall health. We're not seeing, as you said, like these transformative effects that we're hoping for, and then thinking it's actually not doing anything. But you've mentioned it there about the importance of having it together. So, I mean, for somebody who is on more of a restrictive diet, I'm just trying to think about this, because if you're having like a very good, high quality diet, including all of your nutrients, then you should be trying to support these nutrients together. And that makes me
Mm-hmm.
think, actually, maybe that's why the outcome of food studies maybe do sometimes better than supplement studies, because you're not just isolating one nutrient. But
Yeah.
is it important then for someone to take a multivitamin when they're thinking about this? Like, what's kind of the concept of if somebody is plant-based or has more of a restrictive diet for multiple health reasons, whatever that will be,
Mm.
what should be their approach when they're thinking about this and their brain health in general, such as, their B vitamins or omega-3 or, their creatine, like, to give them some direction rather than just buying single supplements off the shelf
Yeah. I Obviously, the ideal is that you get as much of this from your diet as possible.
as
Um,
possible.
However, many of the foods that contain the nutrients that I've talked about we're talking eggs, meat, and seafood. At this point, we've talked
Mm-hmm.
about, and that's the same, particularly for B12 of the B vitamins. But we're talking about choline and creatine as well. So if you are on a restricted diet, and I think we talked about this last time, like, people thrive on a wide variety of diets, right? So just
Mm-hmm.
because I said that I like this particular food for this nutrient, right, doesn't mean that you have to eat it. Of course not.
Mm-hmm.
But the easiest way to really figure out what you should do, I think, is to test if you can. So there are a whole range of nutrients that we know are critical for brain health. We also have tests that you can do for them. So iron, vitamin D, B12 and folate, but particularly homocysteine, because that can also tell you about B6 and B2, which is riboflavin. Um, like, these are just these critical nutrients for an omega-3
Mm-hmm.
status, the other one, and they're easily testable. So before you worry about whether you should supplement or whether your diet is insufficient in these nutrients, the best thing to do is test if you can.
See where your baseline is. Actually, it's the most
Yeah.
important thing to then understand where you can kind of tweak and support your health. I think you mentioned there something really, really critical, which is where I started becoming really obsessed is not the word, very passionate about brain health. So I found out I was dyslexic when I was studying biochemistry. It was an absolute nightmare trying to finish that degree. Being a dyslexic, I made up so many new enzymes along the way. So I very much appreciate your biochemistry lecture that you just gave us. But something that I was really fascinated about was when I was learning about omega-3s, then I wanted to figure out, okay, well, dyslexia, how could that kind of play? And my first dissertation I ever did was on omega-3 supplementation with autistic, ADHD, autism minds. But what it led me into was a third trimester of looking at
Mm.
pregnancy and thinking about kind of that brain development. And again, this is completely anecdotal, this last bit, but speaking to my mum, who barely ate in pregnancy because she suffered so bad with morning sickness. So she just basically ate stale bread all the time. Maybe come to think, the importance of a woman's diet, especially in that third trimester, and is there ever going to be a link with brain development and, autism and dyslexia and ADHD? So when it comes to a woman's pregnancy, what should they be thinking about in regards to their diet and their health? I think that's really important. And you work so much in this area. And then also, do you know any kind of links regarding brain health and certain nutrients, or certain ways of thinking about food with people that are neurodivergent, because I think it's such a big area, and so many people are always looking for how they can support themselves with diet when it comes to ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. But it's quite a vast landscape. So I wanted to ask you if you see anything in that area as well.
Yeah, the the most interesting thing to me about like all of this span, right? I do work in the neonatal brain, then the older brain, as well as the injured brain, and
Many
I
brains.
think any brain, like we only get one brain, right? And the thing that's kind of seemed more and more clear to me is that the rules for what makes a healthy brain are fairly consistent. I won't say that
Mm,
they are always the same, but they seem to be fairly consistent. So the question you asked, the answer, I think, is generally the same, right? So, um, what are the critical components of brain development in the third trimester, like from a nutritional standpoint? Um, then iron, like iron, really accumulates in that third trimester. Iron is really critical for white matter development, in particular. Omega 3s, like you said, we know that B vitamin status is critical in pregnant
mm,
women. Um, Obviously, there's been a large campaign around folate or folic acid for neural tube defects, but it's
yeah.
just you know much more important than the other B vitamins are important as well. It's probably
Hmm.
also important not to supplement too much with folic acid. I think there's people are now considering that we've probably gone too far in the other direction. Like we're so worried about neural tube defects that women are taking massive doses of folic acid, and if you take the B vitamins in largely mismatched proportions, that may have some issues, and we're sort of talking. It's largely hypothetical here, but this is something that people are certainly looking at. Um, so and then um, so then all those things I think are all remain critical as the brain
Mm,
continues to develop. So um, if you miss out on some of those opportunities for nutrient accumulation in the third trimester, like
hmm.
if you're born extremely preterm. So this is a, a patient group that I do a lot of work with. Statistically, I'll say I'm not clinically looking after them, but I work with clinicians who do look after these babies, and we generate a lot of data. So we look at what can we look at in terms of their long term health outcomes based on these various things. And if you're born at 28 weeks, you essentially miss almost all of, if not all of, the third trimester. This is a baby who's born extremely preterm, so you miss out on all of these nutrients, and so now then we have to try and replace them in the neonatal intensive care unit. But if you're born extremely preterm, then you do have an increased risk of cerebral palsy, being some kind of neurodevelopmental impairment, including a
Mm,
range of neurodivergent neurological outcomes. So that's probably at least partly related to nutrient status and whether you're getting those nutrients in the way that you would normally get them during that critical period of brain
mm,
development. Of course, at the same time, um, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's going on with these babies. They have lung issues, they have gut issues, they get exposed to a whole bunch of drugs just to try and keep them alive. So it's a very complex picture, of course, but part of
mm,
this increasingly seems to be what nutrients or hormones, other things, because like thyroid hormone is super important.
yeah.
Growth hormone and IGF-1 are super important, and all of these drop when you're born extremely preterm because they're not being supplied by the placenta anymore. So all of this is a big part of it, but nutrients certainly play a role. Um, so then in these in all people, right, when we all exist on a range of cognitive and emotional functions, and
Hmm.
so then I think all of these nutrients remain important, regardless of your current neurological state, for one of a better word. I think you could still see, could I, maybe benefit from some omega threes, or do I have an elevated homocysteine, which means that I need to make sure that I'm getting enough riboflavin in my diet. and that's actually relatively simple to do. So my answer is essentially, after all of that, my answer is the same. It's always important. It seems to be important for the brain throughout the entire lifespan. So I'd start with those core
Mm.
nutrients that we just know are critically important. We know we can test, we know are easy to supplement with or are easy to get from the diet. And that's not going to solve every problem. But I
Mhm.
think that's a good starting place.
And go through this again: iron, omega-3, B vitamins,
And vitamin D.
choline, vitamin D
Choline, yeah.
as well.
The reason why I don't mention, so choline, absolutely, and choline, um, insufficient choline intake seems to maybe be contributing to a lot of metabolic disease that we're having, particularly fatty liver. Choline is incredibly important for brain development, so it's essential that mums get enough choline. This isn't a good test for choline, whereas there are tests for the other
Mm,
things. But choline
the other
is absolutely
ones.
another one. Yeah, choline's another one I would have on that list. Absolutely.
Okay, amazing. And I think it's just one of those things, isn't it? When I think something that I have always wanted to help improve is my focus,
Hmm.
or more so maybe my processing speed. That's something that, and my niece and nephew have autism, and I know there's certain things that they really need support on. And so when you do have kind of a weakness in any area where there's also an opposing strength, which, I love what you said, like no brain is never bad. But understanding that there might be possible ways to support yourself
Hmm.
really fascinates me. And that's why I became so obsessed around brain health and mental health and how can we actually support ourselves. And there's a plethora of areas that we can do, but diet is definitely one, but it's multifactorial, which I know that we're going to speak about in a little bit more detail. But something you talk a lot about, which I find really fascinating, is kind of the stimuli that we need to kind of in, not increase, well, increase, but also not reduce our cognitive functioning. So you talk a lot about emphasizing your cognitive demand and having a primary status. So basically using different things throughout your day of testing your brain and allowing it to feel that it's not overloaded or overwhelmed, but your brain's using different areas to activate to kind of keep that strength and resilience going. Can you talk a little bit about how we can, outside of our diet, support our brain health and help reduce cognitive decline in the long term, which I feel like we're all quite scared of because dementia, I think it is still, but it definitely was one of the leading causes of death in the UK, preventable deaths anyway.
Yeah, I think the UK is one of the few countries where Alzheimer's disease has overtaken heart disease. Heart disease is still the number one
Yeah.
cause of death across most of um, the high income or high resource world. Um, but you're right, Alzheimer's disease is creeping up mainly because we're getting old, we're living longer, and we're getting better
Mm,
at preventing heart disease. So like that's good news, but it just means that we now need to focus on other
it's
stuff
shifted.
as well. Yeah.
Mm,
Um, so I think of the brain like I think about a muscle, and they're
mm,
actually surprisingly similar.
yeah.
Um, the everybody wants to talk about diet, which is great. I love talking about diet. It means I get to talk about biochemistry. And I think people are starting to appreciate the importance of sleep, maybe managing stress.
Mm,
Like all of these things affect the brain, and they fit into the bigger picture of brain health, absolutely. But the primary driver of initial brain development, and then I think what drives brain development, I've already said this several times, what drives brain development, I think, is also critically important for maintaining brain health throughout the entire lifespan. The primary driver of brain development is stimulating the brain, is creating what I call cognitive demand. And when I say what I really mean is myself and my very close colleague, Dr. Josh Turknett, who's a neurologist, and or anytime I talk about any of this, it's work that he and I have done together. We've written papers about it, and we have a podcast, and we talk about it a lot. But the idea is that the brain responds to stimulus just like your muscles respond to stimulus.
mm,
Say if you're doing some kind of exercise, and the biochemical response pathways are actually quite similar. So imagine you wanted to get bigger and stronger, right? You want to get bigger biceps. So you go to the gym and you lift weights. And um, if you didn't lift weights, but you still wanted to get bigger biceps, right? Imagine you had a perfect diet and you slept great and you had no stress. Like all of those things are important for building muscle. but your muscles don't get bigger if you don't lift weights. Like
Mm.
it's just a fact of the matter. And the brain seems to be the same, right? We can remove things that are problematic, right? We can remove maybe if we smoke, or we drink too much alcohol, or we're stressed all the time, or we have insufficient nutrient status. We can That's like taking the brakes off. But if you want to really drive improvements in function, you have to stimulate and challenge the brain, right? Just like if you want to grow
Mm.
bigger biceps, you have to lift weights. So
Mhm.
then the question becomes, well, what do you want your brain to be good at? And each of us wants our brains to be good at different things. Josh is an exceptional banjo player, and he wants his brain to be really good at playing banjo. Um, I really like to write statistical code in R. So I want my brain to be good at writing code, right? So we each want our brains to be good at different things. So then there
Mhm.
are some commonalities, right? We want to be able to focus, and we want to be able to like remember where our keys are when we left them, right? We want to remember the names of our loved ones. There are some basics, but beyond that, we each want our brains to do different things. So then it's,
Mm.
well, how am I stimulating my brain to become good or better at that specific function? And what's nice is that some of these core, very human activities stimulate several networks across the brain, so that if you're learning how to dance, for instance, you're also making sure that your working memory is better, because they've shown that with video games, right? These complex 3D video games where you're interacting with the environment, that improves working memory. So when you're doing these complex functions, these complex skills and tasks, you're actually also supporting some of those common brain functions that we all want to have. So
Mm.
that's really the key to long-term cognitive function, is how am I, first of all, broadly stimulating my brain, and that's going to include types of movement. It's going to include languages, music, some of these complex, again, very human skills and tasks that stimulate several networks across the brain. But then there are also more niche skills that we might want to have, um, and uh, you then have to think about, am I stimulating those uh, in a consistent manner? Because what we tend to do is, when we're younger, we learn how to walk, we learn how to talk, we learn social interaction. These are the hardest things you will ever learn in your entire life. And that is when you are maximally
Mm.
stimulating your brain. You're spending all your time learning and then sleeping in order to actually solidify that learning. But then as you go through school and university, if you go to university, you continue to stimulate the brain, but it's not as hard as learning how to walk. And then you go to work and you feel busy, but you're essentially just doing the same thing again and again and again and again and again. And so what you're doing over
Mm.
time is you're decreasing the amount that you're stimulating your brain in that sort of development focused way, and as a result, function uh, tends to decline. So that's the most critical component of long-term brain health. And you mentioned focus. Like, focus is a learned skill. Like, you can't just spend years not focusing on anything and then expect to be able to focus for hours on end, unfortunately. And this is the same for every skill that we might want to do, right? If you're working at the edges of your current function, which is what we do when we learn a skill, right? We learn how to play the piano, and we're playing a piece that's kind of hard for us, and we're like making mistakes. And actually, making mistakes is really critically important because it drives neuroplasticity. So you have to fail at stuff. It's good for your brain, even though it
Mm.
feels terrible. Um,
Love that.
and so we're kind of working at the edges of our current function, but we can only do that for short periods of time, right? You can't play the piano badly for hours on end. Like you do, like I don't think anybody can do that. Um, but so think
I
about
don't think
like
you'd have any
10.
neighbours if you
No,
did.
that was why I was always really bad at practicing instruments when I was a kid. Because I was like, the neighbors can hear me. This is terrible. But nowadays, actually, with modern instruments, you can just listen to them through headphones. So that's
It's
less of a
true.
barrier. Anyway, so any skill that you're trying to develop, you need to spend short periods of time working at the edges of your current capacity, and then you need to back off and give yourself time to rest and recover. And that's the same for focus, just as it's the same for learning how to write computer code, just as it's the same for learning how to dance or a new language or a musical instrument. We need these periods of intense kind of practice where we try and push the edges of what we're currently capable of, and then we need to back off and allow ourselves times rest and recover. Just like you can only go to the gym for a certain period of time, you can only lift, you can only
Mm.
do so many bicep curls in one session, but then actually when you get bigger, when you get stronger, when your brain develops new connections, when you're resting and recovering afterwards.
So it makes me think actually that, because it could be misinterpreted, right? Thinking, oh, I've got to constantly stimulate my brain.
Mm,
But I also sometimes think we can be overstimulated. There's just
absolutely.
so much happening with our brain from the moment that we're working to how many things. Even when I'm thinking about how I get contacted via work, it's via WhatsApp, it's via email, it's via Instagram. And there's so many different forms of how someone's contacting you. Your brain is constantly trying to navigate what it's meant to be focusing on. So, like, how should we be looking at what you're saying, which is like obviously using kind of stimulation towards helping support our cognitive health, but also being aware that there is a barrier and not overstimulating our brain health? Like, how do we navigate that?
So the important thing to say is that those are two very different things and very different ways of using our brain, right? So if when you're responding to work related messages across 5 different platforms, that is not stimulating beneficial adaptations in the brain. That is not the kind of stimulus and demand that we're talking about. And there's now huge bodies of work in the areas of multitasking and task switching which say that that is both, it like decreases your ability to focus and get actual work done, but also
Mm.
it is actually very physiologically stressful to have to continuously monitor and respond to a whole range of messages across different platforms with on different tasks, um, and try and juggle all of that as well as what we're trying to do is actually get some work done half the time. So
Hmm.
there are lots
It's like
of important.
counterproductive.
Yes, absolutely. And so Gloria Mark has a recent book called Attention Span, which talks about a lot of this because a lot of that research is hers. So that, like I said, I don't think that that is cognitive stimulus. I think that is just chronic cognitive stress, for want of a better word.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
Whereas cognitive stimulus is concerted, effortful practice of some kind of skill, be that learning how to walk when you're a baby or learning how to speak a second language when you're in your 50s. That's what I mean about cognitive demand and stimulus. The rest, we'll just call it chronic cognitive stress. And we know that some acute stress is good, right? I think actually the cognitive stimulus is a short burst of beneficial stress, whereas there's other things that are these like chronic stresses that are, right, we call them stimulating, um, and they may be like emotionally stimulating. They often are.
Mm.
They can be very very stressful, and arousing. Arousing, that's another good word. But it's just not the same thing. So we have to separate them out entirely, and we have to do some of that stuff, right? The task switching, the
Mm.
multitasking, right? All of us are going to have to do a little bit of that, but the most important thing, I think, in both buckets is making sure that we have time to recover from it and adapt appropriately.
Recovery is such a big thing. Honestly, it's what when you take time off work, even for a couple of days, you do feel your productivity increase. But it's such an odd scenario because everyone listening to this, I feel, knows that in some sense,
Hmm.
but we still don't do it. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, even though we know it's good, why do we not do it? It's such an kind of important question back to ourselves because a lot of this stuff, like we know to recover, but it's harder to do it. So it's a very interesting question to pose back to yourself. And as you're talking about this, do you know what's coming to my mind?
What?
So if you're not a UK listener, this might not make sense to you, but in the UK, there's I don't know if they still do it because now Uber's come in, but London cabs, I know for many years had to look and know, and it still amazes me. I get into the back of a black cab and I say I would like to go here, and they know the route without a sat nav, and they basically have to study how they get around London to get through their test. And it's such an intensity of understanding, knowing every single route, every single road throughout London, and basically having it as a map in their brains. They do not at all look at a sat nav. And it amazes me. Every time I get in, they just know where they're going. That
You
makes me
know,
just,
this is
as you're talking about it, that's what I'm thinking in my brain.
so. Do you know what? This is actually what that specific example is one of the examples that I use of how the brain responds to specific cognitive demand to improve function. Right? There's actually a study on this. It was published in Current Biology.
No.
Yeah, like almost 15 years ago now. So what they did is so anybody who doesn't know about black cabs, if you wanted to be a cabbie in London, you had to learn the knowledge, is what they call it. And the knowledge,
That's what it is.
the knowledge is being able to memorize 25,000 streets, a 6-mile radius circle around Charing Cross Station. That's the knowledge, and you have to memorize it. You have to know, be able to navigate anywhere on that map in your head without a map. And they looked at people who were studying for the knowledge, and these tend to be individuals in their sort of mid-30s, right? So now we're into a later period of life, and we think we can't learn anything new, right? And it takes at least 2 years in general to learn the knowledge. So they had individuals who successfully passed the knowledge exam, those who studied and didn't pass, and then they had a control group. And what they found was that those who passed had a significant increase in signal intensity in the hippocampus in the brain, right? So that you can see the brain changing on an MRI scan as they become just so good at memorization. So there are now lots of studies with lots of different skills. Like, I've even done this with juggling, right? You learn a specific skill and you can see that area of the brain change on an MRI scan as the brain sort of focuses resources into that area of the brain to support that new function. So they saw that in those who successfully passed the exam, but not in the control group or in those who failed the exam. What's interesting, just like I said earlier, is when you become good at one thing, you become less good at another thing. So actually, those who successfully learn the knowledge, they became less good at more abstract memorization because they were just so good at memorizing this map in their heads. So there's a trade-off, right? If you want to be um, a, a world-class powerlifter, right, you can't be a world-class marathon runner at the same time, and the brain is the same. So what do you want your brain to be good at? And when you're more good at one thing, you become less good at another thing, and there's always these trade-offs. And that's not a bad thing. I think it's just cool. The brain
Mm.
is really good at specializing functions. So that is, I think that the cabbie example is one of my favorite examples of how the brain adapts to challenge to improve function. You can see that when you like measure it in terms of their memory, but you can also see it on an MRI scan.
What I also think is fascinating there is that you were saying it, it's through midlife this can happen. And that was another
Yeah.
thing that came to my mind is that so many times that we just, wow, even, I'm 34 and I'll go, oh, I'm too old to learn something. Well, my brain isn't working sufficiently and it's not going to work because of my age, or I'm too old to learn a language. That's what I say a lot, probably because I struggle to learn a language. But it's interesting, right? We kind of always put it off because we think, well, I'm actually not going to be able to do it at this age. And it's similar to saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks. We kind of have this mentality that actually once we reach a certain age, we're no longer capable. But to me, what you've just said, that doesn't feel like the case. And actually, we feel like we can always adapt and learn new skills in our brain.
Absolutely, yeah. Except for maybe in late stage dementia, this idea that our
Okay.
brain can't adapt and learn in adulthood is 100% wrong. It's just completely
Mm.
false. And there are, again, across a wide range of skills. This has been shown you're teaching individuals in their 70s and 80s new languages, right? There are studies that have shown that it's absolutely possible, and again, you can see changes in the brain, changes in other cognitive functions happening at the same time. There are two important parts of this. One is that, yes, compared to a younger brain, compared to like the newborn developing brain, the adult brain is not as malleable to the environment. And that's an important thing, right? Because you want your brain to be a product of your environment, because then it's adapted to function in the environment that
Mm.
that you function in, right? Like I said, right? If say you're a surgeon, you want those surgical skills to be like hardwired in, and it
Yeah,
for
you
it to be
do.
really difficult for those skills to be lost, which might happen if your brain is just like changing all the time based on all the different inputs that it's getting, right? So you want your brain to have some inertia, to just require a little bit more effort to change. And so that's, it's not that it can't change, it just requires more concerted effort because your brain is already adapted so well to its environment. So
Hmm.
but once we consider that, it's actually not, you know, not unable, or is very able to develop new skills. And one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, why we say, well, I'm 40 and therefore I can't learn a new language, is because we just don't invest the time and effort in it that we did when we were
Mm.
kids, right? Think about the time and effort that a newborn baby, or a toddler invests in learning how to walk. It's like, it's a lot of time. Um,
It's
and
a
think
lot.
about how much time you invested in learning biochemistry, even like regardless of how successfully, how much time you invested in that when you're at university. If you then, you know, once a fortnight, look at your Spanish book for half an hour and you're like, well, I can't learn Spanish. It's just not the same amount of effort that you're putting in. And this is, of course, right. We have responsibilities, we have kids, we have jobs, we're not sleeping properly, right? All of this stuff does play a role. But I think that the main thing is that we just don't invest the time in learning when we're older that we could, or that we did
Mm.
when we were younger. And there's a nice study looking at pianists on this particular topic. So they had um, amateur and professional pianists, and they had young pianists and old pianists. It was like four groups, like amateur, professional, young, old. And what they found is that particularly for piano specific skills, older professional pianists were not worse than the younger ones. But the thing that predicted how good their piano skills were was how much they practice, right? Even as they got into their 50s
Mm.
and 60s. So it all comes down to the amount of time and effort you're investing in learning, developing, and maintaining these cognitive skills that you want to have throughout the rest of your life.
I love that, because this links onto something that you had totally changed my mind about. And now my work has gone so far down this rabbit hole. Thanks to you, Tommy, just so you know. Um, the profound effect of this first episode had on me, because you completely blew my mind, which really relates to this study that you just mentioned. And also, if we just believe that we can do it, if we believe and we set the time to do it, then we'll do it.
Mhm,
It might not be easy, but we'll get there. And there's so much of a conversation around mindset and brain health that is so
mhm,
overlooked on just how we talk to ourselves. And you had blown my mind. Now I talk about this a lot, on how our physiology can change just by the interpretation that we have on ourselves. And you
mhm,
mentioned two fantastic trials, which was one on endurance athletes where they were put onto a treadmill, and one was told that they had an endurance gene that made them run faster, and one was told that they didn't have this good endurance gene. And obviously the ones that were told they had this endurance gene obviously kind of outperformed their personal best and the other group, and very similar to how they also responded to a meal. If they found out they had the FTO gene,
mhm,
they hormonally responded to that meal completely differently if they thought that they had this fat gene or if they didn't have the fat gene. That blew my mind so much that I thought, my gosh, what else is the impact of just how we're talking to ourselves? And it made me think a lot about, and I know you'll have so much to say on this, which is why I'm excited to ask you about, when we look at trials, right? We obviously always, before we kind of go to any medical trial, we always want to do a placebo controlled trial. And we know about the nocebo effect that has on us. So even
mhm,
administering a drug that is a placebo, we normally can sometimes see a change in how we respond to that because we believe that it's doing something to us. So
mhm,
when it comes to kind of our cognitive, you know, our cognitive mental health state and our mindset and the importance of it, for you, how do you think about this in terms to brain function and brain health? Because we spoke a lot about exercise last time. We touched upon diet today. we've touched upon cognitive stimuli, but something that I feel is hyper powerful is just kind of the belief we have in ourselves, and towards our brains, and the mindset that we speak about. So what's your thoughts on this? I'd love to know. I'm sure you're going to recite 10 studies to me.
um, I think the more
You can
I've
see how much of a rabbit hole I've gone down, by the way. Can you? There's literally so many questions, and I'm like, I just don't know where to start. This is such an interesting subject.
it's such an interesting subject, and it's super important. This is kind of the rabbit hole that I've gone down over the years as well. If we go back 10 years, I was just at this point where if you put out enough good information, people will just do the things that will support their health, and they'll be happier and healthier, and that's it. Like, job done, tick. And then particularly like the most impactful person for me on this subject was Dr. Simon Marshall, who's a behavioral psychologist that I've had the pleasure of working with in multiple spheres, that just kind of taught me that whether it's behavior change or self-talk, like the way that our brains affect our physiology is just probably more
Mind blowing.
important. Yeah, and more important than whether we take creatine or not, which, it pains me to say it, but it's absolutely true.
I've
And
got that now on film.
that's going to be the quote that you put on social media, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So where I think this is important is that when it comes to brain health, the thing that I am probably most passionate about right now is going around and telling as many people as possible that story that you have in your head about your brain, about how it doesn't work like it used to. All I can do is make it worse by not sleeping enough and stressing, and having half a bottle of wine occasionally. It's just completely wrong, right? Your brain is
Hmm.
absolutely capable of improving and changing its trajectory of function at any time in your life. Again, except for maybe once you get into true dementia. But there's decades of studies showing that your brain has the ability to adapt and improve at pretty much any age if you give it the right challenge and the support to do so. So this is the most important thing, just like knowing that your brain has this amazing capacity to change and improve if the conditions are correct. So like that's the most, like, so even just starting by acknowledging, do you know what? I
Hmm.
can learn a new language, or I can learn how to
Hmm.
dance. I can learn to play the banjo, right? Even though I'm 50, 60, 70, right? And actually, that is probably what you should really be investing your time in, as you get, into the later stages of life. Then, when it relates to behavior change, I think we see something similar. So there are a few studies. My favorite one is related to exercise, and it's epidemiology, right? It's not a randomized controlled trial, so we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, but it kind of fits into this same picture if we're trying to build a case. So this was using data from NHANES in the US, so it's kind of like a big population data set that's supposed to look like, America on average. And what they did was they cataloged up, loads of things related to health, education status, disease status, blood tests, sleep, all these other things. And then they did two things. These people had accelerometers, so they figured out how much they were moving, day to day, sort of like wearing a
Mm.
pedometer or an accelerometer. So they had some measure of like actual physical activity. But then they asked people, how much do you think you exercise compared to other people like you? And then it was like about the same or less or more. And what they found was that people who said that they exercise less than people like them died sooner, regardless of how much exercise they were actually doing. So the way that I interpret that is, if you're going around, and this could be sleep, this could be diet, this could be physical activity, and what you're telling yourself is, I'm not doing enough, I'm not working hard enough, my sleep isn't good enough, my exercise isn't enough, right? What you're doing is you are socially demoting yourself, right? You're giving yourself a lower social rank, which activates that same pathway. And then in this study, after adjusting for a whole host of things, that was associated with a higher mortality risk. And again, This is not like cast iron evidence, but it kind of makes sense that the way that we view ourselves compared to others affects our physiology, and that affects
Mm.
our health. And the two ways that I think are most relevant for us in this conversation is, one, social media. Like, how are we comparing ourselves to others, and how is that affecting us mentally? Then also is, how are we thinking about the various lifestyle factors that we know are important but we're not doing? Are we constantly beating
Mm.
ourselves up about that? Which again, is driving this same process.
Honestly, it's just hearing that. I mean, I obviously was at the epitome of social comparison being a model for many, many, many
Mhm.
years. And that pivoted my work because of my entire body shut down on me. And uncovering this work, I'm like, wow, my body shut down for a multitude of reasons, like, from the stress I was under and, how I looked after myself or how I was eating and everything.
Mhm.
But literally telling myself every day that I wasn't good enough. And also, 20 people telling me as well that I wasn't good
Yeah.
enough. I mean, it's a complete like a compounding ecosystem of just always feeling like a failure. And I
Mhm.
think about that now, as you just said, in relation to social media, where I just now think every single person goes through this on a daily basis. I mean, the
Yeah.
moment someone wakes up, the majority of people listening to this will look at their phone in the morning, right? When they first wake up, already you're hit with comparison. Or, oh, that person's gone out for a run this morning and I haven't. Or,
Yeah.
this person's taking X and I haven't. And so that kind of, it just compounds throughout the day. It is something I just don't think spoken about. And I wonder why that when we think about opening social media and looking at certain things with mental health or brain health, why it's not spoken about as much as it should be. Do you have like any understanding why? Because the more I'm uncovering about this, the more I'm just going, this is like the elephant in the room that's just not spoken about. Because I can guarantee you, every single person listening to this has an internal critic
Mm.
that's really loud inside of them. Um, Yet we all just kind of go around saying we're fine the whole time, and trying to do better. And we kind of never kind of hit this like internal narrative that we're not good enough conversation.
There's maybe two parts to it. One is that actually there's plenty of stuff out there that's driving this internal
Mm,
narrative, which is like,
mm.
you got to grind, you've got to work hard, you're not working hard enough, right? And like, amazingly, this message is still out there. Like, the
Yeah.
90s called and they want their failed culture back. Like, what? I just do not understand why there's still people out there driving this narrative. Um, and now, of course, yeah, that's in the context of, I just told you that you should be working hard on some things, right? You should do difficult things. Absolutely. You should do exercise. That's hard, right? You should learn skills. That's hard. But this sort of like, you're never good enough, and that, that's not how these sort of like that relatively external, motivation locus, like that that is not gonna foster long-term either mental or physical health. So that's one of it. Like, still that message still exists, which I think is completely incorrect,
Mm,
um,
mm.
and is probably driven by substantial trauma on the behalf of, well, I don't want to analyze people from afar, but that seems to be driving a lot of it, at least from those who are sort of still, maintaining that message out in the popular media.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other part of it is that this is really difficult to study, and there's maybe only like a decade of work where people have really looked at, how does our social environment and our self-talk and our internal narrative affect our physiology. And we're only right at the beginning of starting to appreciate that. So I think it's probably a bit of both of those things, as well as it's like, it's hard, right? What's the answer, right?
Mm,
The answer to
mm.
a bad night of sleep is to take some creatine. Not really, but you know what I mean.
Do you have any tools for yourself and how you do this? I mean, this is literally like how you work on this internal narrative every day. Like, what tools? Because you know the importance of it, right? You kind of have, like me, done a deep dive. But like, how do you go through every day trying to engage in positive self-talk? Like, what tools do you use?
So I don't like, I don't profess to be like perfect at this, of course. Like, I still have that that narrative, right? There are things I want to achieve in my career, and when I see other people achieve them, I'm like, oh my god, like how am I? How can I not? How am I not as good as that person? Like, why have I not achieved that yet? And so we all do this, and I don't
Yeah.
think we can. We're never going to eliminate it entirely, right? This is kind of how
Yeah.
we're built. We're these social animals, and that's always going to be part of it, right? Our brain is constantly looking for these to make these comparisons. Um, so one thing is uh, removing from your social media feed people who say drive some of this narrative in you. If right, so maybe
Mm.
there are like some people who they're just like they're a lot like you, or you see a lot of yourself in them. And then when you see them achieve something or do something or showing something that is gonna impart those feelings in you, maybe you say, "Is this actually useful for me to follow and see regularly?" Right. So that's one thing that I think we can
Mm.
certainly do, and that could be the case with podcasts or whatever whatever platform you use. Um, the most useful thing to me long term, and as somebody who struggled with what we would probably call exercise addiction, might even called orthorexia, like back in the day, um, is talking, like showing myself that I'm wrong, right? And I talked about the
Mm.
importance of making mistakes, and one of the most important part of making a mistake or making an error is learning from it, right? You can't just like make a
Mm.
mistake if you don't then drive some corrective process. So it's almost an automatic behavior at this point. But the reason why I've got to where I am on some of those things that we talked about in terms of exercise and diet and some other things is that I've just showed like the drivers of that, which were internal. I've
Mm.
just like, look at this thing here. You have objective data, and you were wrong about this, right? And when you do that enough, um, you have to be willing to change your mind. And like, again, I'm not perfect at it, but those are probably the two main things: is like decrease your exposure where you can, particularly if you know that there's something that triggers you, and then go through some process of showing yourself where that internal talk has been incorrect, right? And science is the process of getting less wrong over time. And so I at least me personally, I kind of approach it in that kind of scientific manner. But you obviously have to be willing to be wrong and then learn from your mistakes as you go.
Mm. And I guess having time, right? There's such a part within that that's mindful. And
Oh
I
yeah.
know that there's like that can feel like a very like woo-woo term. But having mindfulness around this, like actually just having time to sit back and go, let me just have a look at how I spoke to myself the
Mm,
last 24 hours. Let me just actually see where, maybe I've taken the wrong term, or maybe where I've messed up the last few months on certain things. Let's just actually take a moment to reflect on that, as well as reflecting on the environment and the stimuli that's actually maybe causing more anxious thoughts or more kind of
mm,
self-criticism. I think is such a big thing, because I spoke about earlier, having that overwhelmment and that multitasking. And I sometimes feel like we never give ourselves a break. And I was at a talk the other day talking about the importance of self-compassion. And somebody said to me, I just feel that I can't even get a break to think about what I'm trying to do. What can I do?
mm,
And it was a really simple answer. I just said, can you just take one day? Just take one day. 300, just take one day. Give yourself that one day. And, even saying something like so simple, but yet we don't give ourselves that time
mm.
is really important. And it ties into like the rest and recovery that you spoke about. Like actually never giving ourselves kind of a second to think about this stuff is such a critical factor, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that if you can take one day or several days or whatever, that's fantastic. But I think we also have to acknowledge that, and I see this all the time, right? If you take a day, you can spend that day and you're like, well, I'm being mindful, I'm looking after myself, but the guilt builds of the
I
things that you're
know.
not doing, right? So it doesn't have to be a day.
But
Why not
then
take?
that's something else. That's something else, right? You shouldn't
Yeah,
feel
no,
guilty about
no,
taking a day, isn't it?
100%, of course. Like, and this is also something. So my wife and I talk about this a lot because this is actually something that I'm quite good at. Like, if I'm just like, I'm not going to do anything right now for this hour or for this day, I do not feel guilty about it. Like
Yeah,
no
amazing.
problem whatsoever. But it is a learned skill. So then why not make it 20 minutes? And again, like Gloria
Mm,
Mark's work shows, like you take a 20 minutes, go for a walk outside, right? No podcasts, no social media, just outside,
yeah,
right? Maybe it has to be 10 minutes to start, right? Because like it's hard if you've never done it before. So just
totally.
start with something like that, and then even that can be restorative. That can help you then get back into your work with a new frame of mind and with more focus. So even just these small chunks, just and then build up from there. Because of course, right, you should be able to take a week
Mm.
off and not feel guilty about it, like of course. But right,
I'm still not there yet.
it's difficult. So some of those small breaks, and like you said, this is also something that I find myself doing. Like if I
Mm,
immediately respond negatively to something, like either like I get really frustrated, or I sort of look at something, I'm like, and I have that like, why haven't I done that, or I can't believe that, like I'm not doing that. Then it's just like you just need a beat to be like, come on, Tommy, like think about all this other stuff that you're doing and you've achieved. So
hmm
like, and that is part of being mindful, right? You just like just that minute to like think you're talking nonsense to yourself right now. But we all do it. But you need to talk back at least, and sometimes it just takes a few seconds. But that's something that is going to be important as well.
It is, and I love that we've mentioned this because it is a learnt behavior. Like it's, and I
Mm.
don't want anyone listening to this thinking it just comes naturally and inherently.
No.
Because my gosh, I have to work at becoming more positive than negative in my mind. We'll always remember what happens to us negatively throughout our day. Very rarely will we celebrate the small wins. We just don't do it.
Mm.
But as you said, like making sure that we actually just reference that is so important. And it's about everything that you spoke about today. It takes time, it takes
Mm.
practice, it takes like reiteration. So you just can't expect it to happen instantaneously. I think like you and I probably have to work at this as a daily basis to kind of get that to be the main kind of component, but it's still work. And that's what's really important. So I love that we've kind of finished off our conversation there, because for me, I really believe that is one of the most important things when it comes to our mental health. And I have you to thank to kind of opening my eyes to that. Tommy, what does live well, be well mean to you?
Maybe there's two answers. The first one is like in particular, if you want to have, if we think about live well, be well in the frame of cognitive function or brain health, which is kind of what we've been talking
Mm,
about, then remembering that your brain is this amazing thing that has the capacity to change and improve if you give it the right inputs. So learn a new skill with a friend, right? Go to a dance class, like these, and your brain will love you for it. Um, and then to kind of tie into the later bit, I think living well and being well, particularly in our modern society, as we tend to be like knowledge workers, or these kind of work in the in that kind of environment where there's constant demands and task switching and multitasking and all those platforms, and pressures elsewhere. Then I think you mentioned it, and it's one of my favorite things to say, which is about celebrating the small wins, right? So it's not about
mm,
the gulf between what you're doing and what you think you should be doing, because if you focus on that, you end up in those scenarios that we talk about. But it's about, I actually went for that 20-minute walk today and I felt great afterwards, and that's fantastic. And it's not you know training for a marathon, but that is a massive win for me. And like tomorrow I'll try and do it again. I think that's where we should be focusing our efforts, and then all the living well and being well will kind of follow on from that.
mm. I made a conscious decision last year to always celebrate those small wins. And
Yeah.
honestly, I now remember them all because I took a moment to kind of recognize them. And that's been quite like a game changer for me in
Mm.
this kind of entire thing. Otherwise, I just would forget them along the way. And so I would say to anyone listening, celebrate those small wins, whatever that is for you. I feel like, Tommy, that would be a shot of creatine for you.
Yeah, that's absolutely how I celebrate my wins every morning, is with my creatine.
Thank you so much, though, for coming on. I know we could talk for ages. I have so many more things I always want to ask you, but for our listeners that want to find out more about where to find you, your podcast, everything, can you please tell everyone? And obviously, I'll link all of everything you say in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So Josh and I, like we mentioned, we have a podcast. It's the Better Brain Fitness Podcast. It's a question and answer format. So there's a website where you can go on, you can leave a voice note, or you can type in a question, and then we answer a question every week. So if you have a question about
Love
anything
that.
I talked about today, come here, or go there, look at the podcast, and send us a question. We also have a Substack, which is related, but also has some articles and things that we write, or if we publish other things, they end up there. So that's betterbrain.fitness. If you just throw that into your web browser, that'll take you there, and you can sign up. It's free. And then my Instagram is at Dr. Tommy Wood, where I'll sort of post podcasts and papers and things as they come out.
Amazing. Tommy, thank you so much. I will link that all below in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time today. Again, it's been as enlightening as ever. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. This is fantastic. As ever, I really, really enjoyed being here.